"Just another quiet librarian," they whispered as she walked past. The snickering stopped when security footage showed what happened next. 8 grown men thought they'd found an easy target in the woman organizing books after closing time. They were wrong, dead wrong. What those attackers didn't know was that Sarah Chun had been hiding something behind those wire-rimmed glasses for 15 years, something that would turn their predatory confidence into their worst nightmare. The Millbrook Public Library at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening felt like the loneliest place on earth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune overhead, casting that institutional white glow that made everything look slightly washed out and tired. The smell of old paper mixed with industrial carpet cleaner hung in the air, punctuated by the faint aroma of the coffee that had been brewing in the staff room since morning and was now thick enough to dissolve spoons. Outside, the October rain drummed against the tall windows in steady sheets, turning the parking lot into a mirror that reflected the amber streetlights in wavering pools. The sound created a cocoon of isolation around the building, muffling the occasional car that splashed past on Maple Avenue. Most of the downtown area had already rolled up its sidewalks for the evening, leaving just the diner on the corner and the 24-hour laundromat as signs of life in the gathering darkness. Sarah Chun moved between the stacks with practiced efficiency, her rubber-soled shoes making soft whispers against the worn carpet. At 38, she had the lean build of someone who walked everywhere and ate sensibly without making a production of it. Her straight black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that had been her standard style since graduate school, practical and forgettable in equal measure. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose caught the overhead lights occasionally, giving brief glimpses of dark brown eyes that most patrons never really noticed. Her cardigan was navy blue wool, worn soft at the elbows from years of reaching across reference desks and stretching to retrieve books from high shelves. The fabric had that lived-in quality that spoke of someone who chose clothes for comfort and durability rather than fashion. Beneath it, she wore a white button-down shirt tucked into dark slacks, the uniform of librarians everywhere, designed to project approachable authority without threatening anyone's assumptions about what intellectual people looked like. Cart she pushed squeaked rhythmically on its left front wheel, a sound so familiar that Sarah barely registered it anymore. The books stacked on its shelves represented the day's returns, a random collection of romance novels, self-help guides, cookbooks, and the occasional serious literary work that someone had checked out with good intentions and returned largely unread. Each volume had its place in the Dewey Decimal Universe, and Sarah knew that universe better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. She had been the head librarian at Millbrook for 12 years, ever since the previous librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had retired to Florida with promises to send postcards that never arrived. The transition had been seamless because Sarah had already been doing most of the work anyway. She knew every patron's reading habits, could find any book in the collection without consulting the computer system, and had memorized the weekly schedules of the regulars who used the library as their second home. The teenagers who came in after school to use the internet and pretend to do homework while actually watching YouTube videos. The elderly gentleman who read every mystery novel the library acquired and always returned them exactly one day before they were due. The young mother who brought her toddler to story time on Wednesday mornings and checked out parenting books with the desperate hope of someone trying to figure out life in real time. Sarah understood the rhythm of their needs and arranged her world to accommodate them with the invisible efficiency that kept communities functioning. She was the kind of person who remembered names, made reading recommendations based on casual conversations, and stayed late to help students find sources for research papers on topics she'd never studied but somehow always managed to locate relevant materials for anyway. The reference desk where she spent most of her working hours was an island of organized chaos in the library's main floor. Computer terminals hummed quietly, their screens displaying the catalog system that had replaced the card files she still missed. Stacks of interlibrary loan requests waited in neat piles, each one representing someone's quest for knowledge that their local collection couldn't satisfy. A ceramic mug that read, "Librarians do it quietly," sat next to a small succulent plant that had survived 3 years of irregular watering through sheer determination. Her desk drawers contained the accumulated tools of her profession, staplers that worked reliably, pens that didn't leak, Post-it notes in 7 different colors for organizing complex research projects, and a collection of reading glasses in various strengths because the fluorescent lights and computer screens were slowly wearing down her vision. There was also a small framed photograph of her parents taken at their restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown, their faces bright with the pride of small business owners who had built something lasting. The photograph was one of the few personal touches in a workspace that was otherwise purely functional. Sarah had learned early in her career that librarians who decorated their spaces with too much personality sometimes made patrons uncomfortable, as if personal expression might compromise their ability to provide neutral, helpful service. So she kept her workspace clean, organized, and welcoming without being distracting. The closing routine was as familiar as breathing. Check the study rooms to make sure no one had fallen asleep over their textbooks. Walk through the children's section to collect the picture books that had been scattered during the day's reading sessions. Test the locks on the emergency exits. Count the cash drawer, though it rarely contained more than $20 from copying fees and occasional fines. Turn off the public computers and make sure all the returned materials were properly checked in. Tonight felt no different from the hundreds of other Thursday evenings Sarah had spent closing the library alone. The building settled around her with the small creaks and sighs of an old structure, adjusting to the temperature change as the heating system cycled off for the night. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed off the buildings downtown. She was reshelving the last of the day's returns in the biography section when she heard the front door chime. The electronic tone was cheerful and welcoming during business hours, but after closing time, it carried an edge of intrusion that made her pause with a copy of a Winston Churchill biography halfway to its designated spot on the shelf. "We're closed," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the open floor plan. The sign on the front door clearly stated that Thursday hours ended at 6:30, and it was now almost 7. Most likely, someone had noticed the lights still on and hoped to slip in for a quick book return or to grab something they'd forgotten during regular hours. Instead of the apologetic response she expected, she heard footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with the casual confidence of people who had decided that posted hours were suggestions rather than rules. Sarah set the biography on the cart and walked toward the front of the library, her expression shifting from mild irritation to concern as she counted the silhouettes visible through the frosted glass doors. 8 figures stood in the entrance vestibule, and none of them appeared to be carrying library books. "I'm sorry, but we're closed for the evening," Sarah said as she approached the circulation desk, her voice maintaining the professional courtesy that had become second nature over years of public service. "Library hours are posted on the door, and will reopen tomorrow morning at 9. The first man through the door was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket that had seen better decades and jeans with strategic rips that looked more accidental than fashionable. His hair was pulled back in a ponytail that revealed a neck tattoo featuring a snake wrapped around a dagger. When he smiled, it was the kind of expression that never reached the eyes. "That's all right, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying the mock friendliness that predators used to put their prey at ease. "We're not here for books anyway." Behind him, 7 other men filed into the library's main floor. They moved with the loose coordination of people who had done this before, spreading out to block the obvious exits without appearing to do so deliberately. Their ages ranged from early 20s to late 40s, but they shared the kind of casual menace that came from people who had discovered that size and numbers could usually get them what they wanted. The second man was shorter but more muscular, wearing a tank top despite the October chill outside. His arms were covered in tattoos. That told the story of someone who had spent time in places where body art was both currency and armor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A gold tooth caught the fluorescent lights when he grinned at Sarah's obvious discomfort. "Nice quiet place you got here," he said, looking around the library like he was appraising real estate. "Real private. No one around to bother us while we have a little chat." Sarah's hands found the edge of the circulation desk, her fingers pressing against the familiar wood grain as she tried to process what was happening. In 12 years of working at the library, she had dealt with difficult patrons, occasional arguments over fines, and the rare individual who had too much to drink and needed to be asked to leave. But this felt different. The air in the room had changed, becoming charged with the kind of tension that preceded violence. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said, her training in conflict de-escalation kicking in automatically. "If you're looking for someone or something specific, I'd be happy to help you find it. Otherwise, I really do need to ask you to leave so I can finish closing up." The third man laughed, a sound like gravel being poured into a metal bucket. He was wearing a denim vest over a black t-shirt, with work boots that looked like they had seen actual work. His beard was unkempt, and his eyes moved constantly, scanning the library's layout with the practiced attention of someone cataloging escape routes and potential weapons. "Oh, we found exactly what we were looking for," he said, his gaze settling on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Quiet little librarian, all alone in her book castle. Perfect. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as the situation crystallized into something she had hoped never to encounter outside of news reports and crime statistics. 8 men had entered her workplace after hours, had made it clear they weren't leaving, and were now making comments that suggested their intentions went far beyond simple robbery. The fourth member of the group was younger than the others, probably in his early 20s, with the kind of aggressive swagger that came from people trying to prove they belonged with older, more experienced criminals. His clothing was deliberately intimidating black leather jacket, combat boots, and enough metal jewelry to set off airport security from 3 states away. When he spoke, his voice cracked slightly, betraying the nervousness beneath his affected confidence. "Told you this would be easy," he said to his companions. "Who's gonna stop us? The book police?" This earned another round of laughter from the group, and Sarah realized that her situation was deteriorating rapidly. The men were feeding off each other's energy, building confidence through shared mockery and the obvious power imbalance in the room. She had read enough psychology texts to recognize the dynamics at work, but understanding the theory didn't make her current predicament any less dangerous. The fifth man was silent, but perhaps the most unsettling of the group. He was average height and build, wearing unremarkable clothing that would have made him invisible in any crowd. His face was forgettable except for his eyes, which held the flat, calculating stare of someone who viewed other people as objects rather than individuals. He positioned himself near the main entrance, not blocking it entirely, but making it clear that leaving would require getting past him first. "You know what I think?" the leader said, walking closer to the circulation desk where Sarah stood. "I think our librarian friend here needs to learn some manners. Nobody ignores us when we're trying to have a friendly conversation." Sarah's mind raced through her options. The staff room had a phone, but it was across the library and would require her to turn her back on the intruders. Her cell phone was in her purse, which was locked in her desk drawer. The emergency alarm button was located behind the circulation desk, but she would have to reach under the counter to activate it, and she wasn't sure it would summon help quickly enough to matter. The sixth member of the group was examining the library's layout with professional interest, noting the positions of security cameras, the locations of potential weapons, and the various routes through the building. He was older than the others, probably in his late 40s, with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested experience in situations like this. When he spoke, the younger members of the group listened with deference. "Nice and isolated," he observed. "Sound. Doesn't carry much with all these books around. We could have our fun and be gone before anyone knows we were here." The casual way he discussed their plans made Sarah's blood run cold. These weren't opportunistic criminals who had stumbled into a situation beyond their control. They had chosen this location deliberately, had planned their approach, and were now discussing her fate like she was a problem to be solved, rather than a human being with rights and dignity. The seventh man was fidgeting with a switchblade knife, clicking it open and closed in a rhythm that was probably meant to be intimidating. He was thin and wiry, with the nervous energy of someone who used chemical substances to manage anxiety, and found violence to be an acceptable outlet for the resulting agitation. His clothing was dirty and ill-fitting, suggesting someone who lived on society's margins by choice or circumstance. "How much cash you got here, library lady?" he asked, though his tone suggested that money wasn't their primary motivation. "Must be something worth taking in all these books." Sarah recognized the question as a test rather than a genuine inquiry about the library's assets. They were gauging her responses, looking for signs of fear or compliance that would make their job easier. Every survival instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run, but the rational part of her mind understood that panic would only make things worse. The eighth and final member of the group was perhaps the most disturbing because he seemed so ordinary. He could have been someone's uncle or a coach at the local high school. His clothing was neat and clean, his manner polite and soft-spoken. But there was something in the way he looked at Sarah that suggested appetites that normal people didn't discuss in polite company. "We should probably lock the door," he suggested mildly. "Wouldn't want anyone interrupting us while we're getting acquainted with Miss Librarian here." The casual horror of his suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite started burning yet. Sarah understood that whatever these men had planned, it would be easier to accomplish if they could guarantee their privacy. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place would be the sound of her options disappearing. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the situation moved beyond talking and into something that would change her life forever, assuming she survived it. The men were still positioning themselves, still feeding off each other's confidence, still treating this as entertainment rather than the life or death encounter it was about to become. In that moment of crystal clarity that sometimes preceded disaster, Sarah made a decision that would have surprised everyone who thought they knew the quiet librarian, who organized community reading programs and helped children with their homework. She had spent 15 years building a careful persona that concealed truths about herself that even her closest friends had never suspected. The men spreading through her library had no idea that they had chosen the wrong target. They saw wire-rimmed glasses and a cardigan and assumed they understood everything they needed to know about the woman standing behind the circulation desk. They were about to learn that assumptions could be dangerous, and that the most dangerous people were often the ones who had learned to hide their capabilities behind facades of helpless normalcy. But for now, Sarah Chun continued to play the role they expected her to play, the frightened librarian, the easy victim, the woman who would plead and cry and make their victory feel earned rather than simply taken. She had no intention of making their night easy, but they didn't need to know that yet. The leader reached the circulation desk and leaned across it, invading Sarah's personal space with the calculated aggression of someone who had learned that proximity was a weapon. His breath smelled of stale beer and cigarettes, and up close, she could see the small scars on his knuckles that suggested a history of using his fists to solve problems. "Now then," he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a seductive whisper, but came across as the hiss of something that belonged under rocks. "Why don't we talk about how this evening is going to go?" Sarah looked at him with the expression of someone who is trying to stay calm despite obvious terror. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award, and it was about to save her life by convincing 8 dangerous men that they had nothing to fear from the woman they had cornered in her own workplace. They were wrong, but they wouldn't understand that until it was far too late to matter. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the circulation desk as the leader leaned closer, his predatory smile widening. Behind those wire-rimmed glasses, her mind was calculating distances, angles, and possibilities with the precision of someone who had spent years training for moments exactly like this one. The frightened librarian act was perfect camouflage, but underneath the trembling exterior, every muscle in her body was coiled and ready. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying just the right amount of terror to keep them confident. "I don't want any trouble. Just take whatever you want and go." The leader chuckled, clearly enjoying what he perceived as complete dominance over a helpless victim. "Oh, we will, sweetheart. But first, we're going to have some fun. Been a long time since we found someone so accommodating." The man with the gold tooth moved closer to the children's section, running his fingers along the colorful book spines. "Look at all these kiddie books," he called out to his companions. "Bet our librarian here just loves reading stories to all the little ones." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. These men had no idea they were standing in a place she considered sacred, threatening to violate a space where children came to learn and dream. The protective instinct that had been carefully buried under years of quiet service began to surface like a submarine rising from deep water. The muscular man in the tank top was examining the computer terminals, unplugging cables with the casual destruction that came naturally to people who had never created anything worth preserving. "Nice setup," he said. "Probably worth something if we strip the good parts out." "Focus," the older, experienced member of the group commanded quietly. "Equipment secondary. We came here for something specific." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. Their leader straightened up and walked around the circulation desk, effectively trapping her between the counter and the wall of reference materials behind her. She could smell his cologne now, something cheap and aggressive that didn't quite mask the underlying scent of unwashed clothing and bad decisions. "You know what I think?" he said, reaching out to touch a strand of hair that had escaped from her ponytail. "I think you're exactly what we've been looking for. Quiet, isolated. Probably hasn't had much excitement in her boring little life." The young man with the combat boots laughed nervously. "Yeah, we're going to show you a real good time, lady. Better than any of those romance novels you probably read." Sarah allowed herself to flinch away from their leader's touch, playing the role of the terrified victim while her mind cataloged every detail of their positions. The quiet man by the door was still blocking the main exit, but he was focused on watching the parking lot through the front windows. The one with the switchblade had moved toward the periodical section, putting himself between her and the emergency exit near the back of the building. "I have money," she said, her voice small and desperate, "in the petty cash drawer. It's not much, maybe $40, but you can have it. Please just don't hurt me." The bearded man in the denim vest snorted with amusement. "40 whole dollars? Gee, lady, that's almost enough for a decent meal. Too bad we're not here for your lunch money." The man with the calculating eyes who had been silent until now finally spoke. "Strip the phones first," he said to his companions. "Cell tower, landlines, everything. Make sure she can't call for help when we're done here." Sarah watched as 2 of them moved toward the staff room where the main phone line connected to the building. She had maybe 90 seconds before they discovered that the library's communication systems were more complex than they realized. The building also had a silent alarm system connected directly to the police station, but the activation button was hidden under the circulation desk, and reaching for it now would reveal that she wasn't as helpless as she appeared. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, letting a note of steel creep into her voice for the first time. The leader paused in his casual intimidation. "What did you say?" Sarah straightened slightly, and something in her posture shifted in a way that would have been invisible to most observers, but registered unconsciously with men who lived by violence. "I said you're making a mistake." The gold-toothed man turned away from the children's books, sensing a change in the atmosphere that he couldn't quite identify. "Lady's getting mouthy," he observed. "Maybe we need to teach her some respect." But the older, experienced member of the group was watching Sarah more carefully now. Something in her bearing had changed, and he had survived long enough in dangerous situations to trust his instincts when they whispered warnings. "Hold on," he said, raising a hand to pause his companions. Sarah removed her wire-rimmed glasses and set them carefully on the circulation desk. Without them, her dark eyes seemed sharper, more focused. When she looked up at the men surrounding her, there was something different in her gaze that made the leader take an involuntary step backward. "My name is Sarah Chun," she said, her voice now carrying a quiet authority that cut through the casual menace filling the library, "and I've been very patient with you." The nervous young man with the knife giggled, the sound high and strained. "Oh. No, guys, the librarian's getting serious. Should we be scared?" Sarah smiled for the first time since they had entered her library. It was not a pleasant expression. "You came into my workplace after hours. You threatened me and discussed plans to assault me. You destroyed property and spoke about harming children who visit this place." The leader's confusion was turning into anger. The dynamic he thought he controlled was shifting in ways he didn't understand. "Lady, I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living in, but you assumed," Sarah continued, her voice never rising above conversational level, "that because I'm a librarian, because I work cardigans and organize books for a living, that I would be an easy target." She began to move around the circulation desk with fluid grace that seemed to flow like water over stone. Her cardigan came off in one smooth motion, revealing arms that were lean but clearly defined with muscle. The modest librarian's outfit had concealed a physique that spoke of years of dedicated physical conditioning. "The thing about assumptions," she said, rolling her shoulders in a motion that loosened muscles and joints with audible pops, "is that they can get you killed." The man by the door finally turned his attention from the parking lot to the conversation happening behind him. What he saw made him reach instinctively for the weapon concealed under his jacket. "Something's wrong here," he said. "This isn't how this is supposed to go." Sarah's hands moved to her ponytail and released it, letting her black hair fall loose around her shoulders. The simple action transformed her appearance from that of a mild-mannered librarian to something altogether more dangerous. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." The leader tried to reassert control through aggression, stepping forward with his fists raised. "I don't care if you think you're some kind of tough girl. There's 8 of us and 1 of you, and we're going to a sentence." Ended abruptly when Sarah moved. The motion was so fast and precise that most of the men didn't process what had happened until their leader was on his knees, gasping for breath and clutching his throat where she had struck him with surgical accuracy. 7, Sarah corrected quietly. The man with the gold tooth lunged at her from the left, moving with the clumsy aggression of someone who had always relied on size and intimidation rather than skill. Sarah sidestepped his charge and used his momentum against him, guiding him face first into the solid oak corner of the reference desk. The impact made a sound like a melon hitting concrete, and he dropped without making another sound. 6. The muscular man in the tank top was faster and more experienced than his companions. He came at Sarah with a practiced combination of punches. That would have overwhelmed most opponents. Instead, she deflected his strikes with movements that seemed almost dance-like, redirecting his force while maintaining perfect balance. When he overextended on a particularly vicious right hook, she trapped his arm and applied leverage that sent him spinning into the biography section. Books scattered as his body hit the shelves with enough force to knock the wind out of him. Before he could recover, Sarah was there, applying pressure to a nerve cluster in his neck that shut down his consciousness like a light switch. 5. The bearded man in the denim vest had pulled a knife from somewhere and was advancing more cautiously than his companions. "Military," he said to the others. "She's had military training." Sarah shook her head. "Close, but not quite." She moved toward him with predatory grace, and he slashed at her with the blade. The knife cut empty air as she flowed around his attack like smoke, getting inside his guard and striking pressure points that made his hand open involuntarily. The knife clattered across the floor as he stumbled backward, suddenly unable to feel his right arm. A knee strike to his solar plexus folded him in half, and a precisely applied elbow to the back of his neck put him down permanently. Sarah picked up his knife and examined it briefly before sliding it into her belt. 4. The young man with the combat boots was backing toward the front door, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. "This is impossible," he stammered. "She's just a librarian. She can't be doing this." The older man who had been giving orders earlier was watching Sarah with the clinical attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Not military," he murmured. "Something else, something I should recognize." Sarah turned her attention to the nervous man with the switchblade, who was now clicking it open and closed with frantic urgency. "Please," he babbled. "We didn't mean anything. We were just messing around. We weren't really going to hurt you." "Yes," Sarah said simply. "You were." She moved like lightning, covering the distance between them before he could react. The switchblade went flying as she twisted his wrist in a direction that wasn't designed to bend. He screamed once before a nerve pinch silenced him and dropped him to the floor among the scattered magazines. 3. The quiet man by the door had drawn a pistol and was aiming it at Sarah with hands that shook slightly. "Stay back," he warned. "I don't care what kind of training you have. Bullets beat karate every time." Sarah smiled that cold smile again. "Two problems with that theory," she said, beginning to circle toward him with movements that kept the stacks of books between them. "First, this isn't karate." She disappeared behind a section of tall shelves, and the gunman swung his weapon back and forth, trying to track her movement through the library's maze of books and furniture. "Where are you?" he called out, fear making his voice crack. "Second." Sarah's voice came from directly behind him. "You're not a very good shot when you're scared." He spun around just in time to see her emerge from behind the circulation desk, having used the library's layout to approach him from an unexpected angle. His finger tightened on the trigger, but her hand was already there, controlling the weapon's direction as it fired harmlessly into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down as she applied a joint lock that made him release the gun. A moment later, he joined his unconscious companions on the library floor. 2. The young man in the combat boots was fumbling with the front door, panic-making, his fingers clumsy as he tried to work the deadbolt that one of his companions had engaged earlier. "Let me out," he pleaded. "Please, I'm sorry. We made a mistake." The older man who had been studying Sarah stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "You're not civilian trained," he said. "I've seen special forces, I've seen federal agents, I've seen contract killers. You move like something else entirely." Sarah collected the pistol from the floor and checked its safety before setting it on the circulation desk. "What I am," she said, "is a librarian who believes that libraries should be safe spaces for everyone, especially children." "But before that," the older man pressed, "you were something else." something that required the kind of training that turns a person into a weapon. Sarah looked at him with those sharp dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Before that, I was someone who made different choices. Someone who believed that violence could solve problems that words couldn't touch. She walked toward the young man still struggling with the door lock. I spent 12 years in a profession that most people don't know exists. Solving problems that governments couldn't acknowledge. Making people disappear who needed to disappear. The lock clicked open under the young man's desperate fingers, but before he could escape into the night, Sarah's hand closed on his shoulder. I retired because I got tired of violence, she continued conversationally. I became a librarian because I wanted to help people learn and grow instead of just stopping them from breathing. She applied pressure to a nerve cluster that dropped him beside the door. 1. The older man was backing away slowly, his hand still raised. Look, lady, whatever your story is, we clearly picked the wrong target. My guys are down, the joke's blown, and I just want to walk away from this. Sarah studied him for a long moment. You organized this, she said. You picked this location because you thought it would be isolated and safe. You brought 7 other men to assault one woman because you thought she would be helpless. It was supposed to be simple, he admitted. Quiet place, no security, no witnesses. We weren't going to hurt you permanently. Just temporarily, Sarah said. Just enough to traumatize me for the rest of my life. Just enough to make me afraid to work late or walk to my car alone or trust that the world is a safe place. The man's shoulders sagged as he realized that reasoning wasn't going to save him. What are you going to do? Sarah walked back to the circulation desk and picked up the phone. I'm going to call the police, she said. They'll find 8 men unconscious in my library, all of them with criminal records, all of them carrying weapons. The security cameras recorded everything from the moment you entered the building. She dialed 911 with practiced efficiency. When they wake up in jail, they'll have a story about being defeated by a librarian. No one will believe them, because no one believes that librarians can fight. The older man made one last desperate attempt to reach the door, but Sarah was faster. Her movement was economical and precise, and he joined his 7 companions. In unconsciousness before the emergency dispatcher finished answering her call. Millbrook Public Library, Sarah said into the phone, her voice returning to the professional tone that patrons knew and trusted. This is Sarah Chun, the head librarian. I need police and medical assistance. 8 men broke into the library after hours and threatened me. They're all unconscious now and will need medical attention before they can be arrested. She listened to the dispatcher's questions and answered them calmly, providing details about the situation without mentioning her role in creating the pile of unconscious attackers scattered around her library. As far as the official record would show, she had simply defended herself against multiple assailants and been fortunate enough to survive the encounter. While she waited for the police to arrive, Sarah walked through the library, checking on each of the unconscious men to ensure they were breathing and positioning them in recovery positions that would prevent choking if they vomited. It was the kind of medical knowledge that came from years of creating unconscious people and wanting them to survive the experience. She retrieved her cardigan and glasses, transforming herself back into the mild-mannered librarian that everyone expected to see. By the time the first police car arrived, she was sitting behind the circulation desk, looking shaken but unharmed, surrounded by evidence of a violent encounter that had somehow gone very badly for the attackers. The responding officers would find 8 men with various injuries consistent with falling, running into objects, and generally having a very bad night. Their weapons would be confiscated, their criminal records would be reviewed, and they would face charges for breaking and entering, attempted assault, and possession of illegal firearms. None of them would remember exactly how they had been defeated, Just that the quiet librarian they had cornered had somehow managed to turn the tables on all 8 of them simultaneously. The story would spread through the criminal community as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating victims, though most people would assume it had been exaggerated in the telling. Sarah would give her statement to the police with the calm professionalism of someone who had dealt with far more dangerous situations than a library break-in. She would thank the officers for their quick response, express concern for the injured, attackers, and volunteer to work with prosecutors to ensure that justice was served. And when the last police car finally pulled away from the Millbrook Public Library, Sarah Chun would lock the front door, turn off the lights, and drive home to her quiet apartment where she would feed her cat, make tea, and read a book before going to sleep. Just another evening in the life of a librarian who had learned that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who looked the most harmless. The building settled into silence, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed off the building's downtown, carrying its lonely call into the night. The first police cruiser arrived within 6 minutes of Sarah's call, its red and blue lights cutting through the October darkness and reflecting off the rain-slicked windows of the Millbrook Public Library. Officer Janet Martinez stepped out of her vehicle with the measured caution of someone who had responded to enough emergency calls to know that situations were rarely what they initially appeared to be. Martinez had been patrolling this district for 8 years and knew the library well. She had spent countless afternoons here as a teenager, hiding from problems at home among the stacks where Sarah Chun would quietly recommend books that helped her imagine different possibilities for her life. The idea that violence had found its way into this sanctuary of learning struck her as fundamentally wrong. She approached the front entrance with her hand resting on her service weapon, though something about the scene felt off in ways she couldn't immediately identify. The building's lights were still on, casting warm yellow rectangles across the parking lot, and through the glass doors she could see Sarah sitting calmly behind the circulation desk. For a situation that had been reported as a violent home invasion, everything looked remarkably peaceful. Sarah opened the doors before Martinez could knock, her face showing the appropriate level of concern mixed with relief at seeing law enforcement arrive. She wore her cardigan and glasses again, looking every inch the mild-mannered librarian that the community knew and trusted. Nothing in her appearance suggested she had just survived a life-threatening encounter with 8 armed men. "Officer Martinez," Sarah said, recognizing the policewoman from years of community interactions. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I wasn't sure how long it would take for help to arrive." Martinez stepped into the library and immediately noticed the unconscious forms scattered around the main floor like discarded mannequins. 8 men lay in various positions throughout the space, some slumped against bookshelves, others sprawled on the carpet between reading tables. All of them were breathing, but none showed signs of consciousness. "Jesus," Martinez muttered, keying her radio to call for backup and medical assistance. "What happened here, Sarah?" Sarah wrung her hands in a gesture that perfectly conveyed the nervous energy of someone who had survived a traumatic experience through luck rather than skill. "They broke in just as I was finishing my closing routine," she explained. 8 of them, all together. They said they wanted to hurt me, that they'd been planning this. She gestured toward the nearest unconscious man, the leader who had first approached her circulation desk with predatory confidence. That one there seemed to be in charge. He was very specific about what they intended to do. Martinez examined the man Sarah indicated, noting the bruising around his throat that suggested some kind of impact or pressure. His breathing was steady but labored, and he would clearly need medical attention before he could be questioned about his role in whatever had transpired here. "How did you manage to?" Martinez paused, looking around at the aftermath of what appeared to have been a significant physical altercation. "I mean, there are 8 of them, and they're all unconscious. What exactly happened?" Sarah's expression showed the perfect combination of confusion and residual fear that anyone would expect from a civilian who had somehow survived a violent encounter. "I'm not entirely sure," she said honestly. "Everything happened so fast. They were threatening me, talking about what they were going to do, and then they started fighting each other." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Fighting each other?" "I think. There was some kind of disagreement about who was in charge," Sarah continued, her tone carrying the bewildered quality of someone trying to make sense of traumatic events. "The older one there by the door seemed to think he should be giving orders, but the younger ones weren't listening. Things escalated very quickly." She pointed to the man with the gold tooth, who was slumped against the reference desk with what appeared to be a significant head injury. "That one charged at the leader and missed, ran straight into the desk corner. The others started grabbing for weapons, and then it was just chaos." Martinez walked carefully through the scene, noting the positions of the unconscious men and trying to reconstruct the sequence of events from the physical evidence. A pistol lay on the circulation desk, safely unloaded. A switchblade knife rested near the periodical section. The man by the front door had obvious defensive wounds on his hands, suggesting he had tried to protect himself from attack. "So they basically defeated themselves?" Martinez asked, though her training made her skeptical of explanations that seemed too convenient. Sarah nodded earnestly. "I hid behind the circulation desk when the fighting started. I heard a lot of shouting and crashing, and then everything went quiet. When I finally looked up, they were all unconscious like this." It was a plausible enough story, particularly given the evidence of multiple weapons and the chaotic positioning of the bodies. Criminal enterprises that relied on intimidation and violence often attracted individuals with poor impulse control and limited ability to work as a team. Internal conflicts that spiraled into violence weren't uncommon. The second police cruiser arrived as Martinez was examining the weapon cache, followed quickly by an ambulance and a fire department rescue unit. Soon the quiet library was filled with first responders, their radios crackling with official communications as they worked to secure the scene and provide medical aid to the unconscious attackers. Paramedic Lisa Wong knelt beside the man with the head injury, checking his pupils and vital signs with practiced efficiency. "This one's going to need imaging," she reported. "Possible concussion, maybe worse. What happened to him?" "Apparently ran into the desk during some kind of internal fight," Martinez explained, still trying to piece together the evening's events. "The librarian says they turned on each other." Wong moved to the next man, the muscular attacker who lay unconscious among the scattered biography books. "This one's got bruising consistent with impact trauma," she observed. "Looks like he hit the shelves pretty hard." Detective Ray Thompson arrived as the paramedics were loading the first of the unconscious men onto stretchers. Thompson was a 20-year veteran who had investigated every kind of violent crime the county had to offer, and he approached the scene with the methodical attention to detail that had made him one of the department's most successful investigators. "Walk me through it," he said to Martinez, who briefed him on Sarah's account of the events while pointing out the physical evidence scattered throughout the library. Thompson listened without comment, making notes in a small pad while observing the positions of the bodies and the locations of the recovered weapons. When Martinez finished her summary, he approached Sarah with the gentle but thorough manner that worked best when interviewing trauma victims. "Miss Chun," he said, "I know this has been a difficult evening for you, but I need to ask some questions about what happened here. Are you feeling up to giving a detailed statement?" Sarah nodded, maintaining the composed but shaken demeanor of someone who was cooperating fully with law enforcement while still processing a traumatic experience. "Of course, Detective. I want to help however I can." Thompson guided her through the events chronologically, asking about the attackers' behavior, their apparent organization, and the sequence of actions that led to their mutual incapacitation. Sarah's answers were consistent and detailed, painting A picture of criminals whose plans had been derailed by their own lack of discipline and coordination. You said they mentioned planning this in advance, Thompson noted. Did they say anything specific about how they knew you would be here alone? Sarah considered the question carefully. The leader said something about it being a quiet place, with no security. I think they may have been watching the library for a while, learning the patterns of when staff members work late. This detail aligned with Thompson's experience investigating similar crimes. Predators often conducted surveillance on their targets, looking for vulnerabilities in security and scheduling that they could exploit. The fact that 8 men had arrived together suggested a level of coordination that went beyond spontaneous criminal activity. Any idea what triggered the fight between them? Thompson asked. I think it was about who was in charge, Sarah replied. The older man seemed more experienced, but some of the younger ones didn't want to take orders from him. When things started getting heated, weapons came out, and then it just escalated beyond anyone's control. Thompson made more notes while the crime scene photographers documented the positions of evidence and the unconscious suspects. The story Sarah told was internally consistent and supported by the physical evidence, but something about the situation continued to nag at him. 8 men, all apparently experienced in violence based on their criminal records and choice of weapons, had somehow managed to defeat themselves so thoroughly that none remained conscious when police arrived. While not impossible, it struck him as statistically unlikely that a group of criminals would turn on each other with such devastating effectiveness. Officer Martinez returned from running background checks on the suspects, carrying a printout that made Thompson's eyebrows rise. These guys all have serious records, she reported. Armed robbery, assault, weapons charges. The older one did time for organizing violent crews. So they weren't amateurs, Thompson observed. Makes it even more interesting that they managed to take each other out so completely. The first of the suspects began regaining consciousness as the paramedics prepared to transport him to the hospital for medical evaluation. It was the young man with the combat boots who had been the least injured of the group. He looked around the library with obvious confusion, his eyes unfocused and his speech slurred. What happened? He mumbled. Where is everybody? Thompson approached the stretcher as the paramedics checked the young man's cognitive function. You're under arrest, he said formally. You and your friends broke into this library and threatened Miss Chun here. The suspect's eyes found Sarah, who was watching from a safe distance with the expression of someone who had been victimized, but was trying to be brave about cooperating with the investigation. The librarian, he said slowly. She was just a librarian. That's right, Thompson confirmed. Miss Chun is the head librarian here. You and 7 other men entered her workplace after hours with weapons and made threats against her. The young man shook his head, wincing at the movement. That's not, something's wrong. She was just supposed to be a librarian. Thompson exchanged glances with Martinez. Suspects often tried to minimize their culpability by claiming confusion or memory loss, but this seemed different. The young man appeared genuinely bewildered by the situation rather than strategically evasive. What do you remember about tonight? Thompson asked. We came here for. The suspect paused, his brow furrowing as he tried to organize fragmented memories. It was supposed to be easy. Just scare her a little, take what we wanted. But then everything went wrong. How did it go wrong? The young man looked at Sarah. Again, his expression troubled. She wasn't what we expected. She was different, dangerous. Thompson made notes while the paramedics finished their assessment. The suspect was stable enough for transport, but would need medical clearance before formal interrogation could begin. His comments about Sarah being dangerous were interesting but could easily be explained as the confused recollections of someone who had suffered head trauma during the evening's events. As the ambulances departed with their unconscious cargo, Thompson continued documenting the scene while Martinez took Sarah's formal statement. The story remained consistent, 8 men had entered the library with criminal intent. Their plans had been disrupted by internal conflict, and they had essentially defeated themselves through poor coordination and excessive aggression. The physical evidence supported this narrative. Multiple weapons suggested the attackers had come prepared for violence. The defensive wounds on several suspects indicated they had fought among themselves. The random positioning of the unconscious men throughout the library was consistent with a chaotic melee rather than a coordinated assault. Detective Thompson had investigated hundreds of violent crimes, and he knew that criminal enterprises often collapse due to internal disputes, especially when multiple individuals with violent tendencies and limited impulse control attempted to work together without clear leadership structures. The fact that this particular group had turned on each other wasn't surprising given their backgrounds and criminal histories. What did surprise him was the thoroughness with which they had incapacitated themselves. 8 experienced criminals, all unconscious, all requiring medical attention, all neutralized without any apparent injury to their intended victim. It was either an extraordinary stroke of luck for Sarah Chun or an extraordinary display of criminal incompetence by her attackers. But both explanations were plausible, and Thompson had learned to trust evidence over intuition when the two conflicted. The evidence clearly showed that 8 men had entered the library illegally, had brought weapons, had made threats, and had then somehow managed to render themselves unconscious through their own actions. As the crime scene technicians finished their work and the last of the emergency vehicles departed, Thompson found himself alone with Sarah in the library that had been transformed from a quiet place of learning into the scene of a violent crime. She sat behind her circulation desk, looking smaller and more vulnerable now that the immediate crisis had passed. "You're sure you're not injured?" he asked. Sometimes adrenaline can mask pain or other symptoms. Sarah shook her head. "I'm fine, Detective. Shaken up, obviously, but physically unharmed. I was very fortunate that their plans fell apart the way they did." Thompson nodded, closing his notebook and preparing to leave. "We'll need you to come in tomorrow to sign your formal statement and look at some photographs for identification purposes. The district attorney will probably want to meet with you as well to discuss the prosecution." "Of course," Sarah agreed. "I want to do everything I can to make sure they're held accountable for what they tried to do here." As Thompson walked toward the front door, he paused and looked back at the librarian, who had somehow survived an encounter that should have ended very differently. "Miss Chun," he said, "you might want to consider upgrading the security here. Motion sensors, cameras, maybe an alarm system that connects directly to the station." Sarah smiled, the expression carrying a hint of something that Thompson couldn't quite identify. "That's an excellent suggestion, Detective. I'll speak to the City Council about improving our security measures." Thompson left the library with the satisfied feeling of having conducted a thorough investigation that would result in successful prosecutions. 8 dangerous criminals would face serious charges. Their intended victim had survived unharmed, and the case would likely be resolved through plea bargains that avoided the need for lengthy trials. He didn't notice that Sarah had waited until his car disappeared around the corner before she began the real work of cleaning up the evening's aftermath. There were books to reshelve, furniture to straighten, and evidence of the night's violence to erase so that the library could return to its normal function as a sanctuary of learning and community service. The security cameras had recorded everything, of course, but Sarah had access to the system and knew how to edit digital files in ways that would preserve the official narrative, while removing any inconvenient details that might raise uncomfortable questions about her background and capabilities. By morning, the Millbrook Public Library would look exactly as it always had, a quiet place where people came to read, research, and find the knowledge they needed to improve their lives. The only lasting evidence of the night's events would be the newspaper story about 8 criminals who had attempted to rob the library and had somehow managed to defeat themselves in the process. Sarah Chun would return to her normal routine of helping patrons, organizing community programs, and maintaining the careful facade of a mild-mannered librarian who had been fortunate enough to survive a dangerous encounter through luck rather than skill. But word would spread through certain communities about what had really happened that night. Criminals would whisper stories about the librarian who wasn't what she seemed, who had somehow neutralized 8 armed men without breaking a sweat or mussing her hair. Most people would dismiss such stories as urban legends, the kind of exaggerated tales that grew in the telling until they bore no resemblance to reality. But a few would remember the lesson that appearances could be deceiving, that the most dangerous people were often the ones who worked hardest to appear harmless. And in the quiet hours after closing time, when Sarah Chun walked alone through her library arranging books and preparing for the next day's patrons, she would remember why she had chosen this life over the one she had left behind. Violence had its place in the world, but it was not here among the stories and knowledge that help people dream of better possibilities. The library was her sanctuary now, and she would protect it from anyone who threatened to bring darkness into this place of light. 3 weeks after the incident, Sarah Chun stood before the Millbrook City Council in the modest conference room that served as the seat of local government. The fluorescent lights hung overhead as she presented her proposal for enhanced library security, her voice carrying the professional confidence of someone who had spent years advocating for community resources. The recent break-in at our library has highlighted significant vulnerabilities in our current security infrastructure, she explained to the 5 council members seated at their worn wooden table. I'm requesting approval for a comprehensive upgrade that will protect both our collection and the patrons who depend on our services. Council member Barbara Hensley, a retired teacher who had been Sarah's strongest supporter during budget negotiations, leaned forward with obvious concern. Sarah, we're all grateful that you weren't seriously hurt during that terrible incident. But the insurance company has already covered the minimal property damage, and the police report indicates that the perpetrators essentially defeated themselves. Sarah adjusted her glasses and opened the folder containing her carefully prepared presentation. While that's true, Mrs. Hensley, we can't depend on criminal incompetence to protect our facility in the future. The proposed security system would include motion sensors, upgraded cameras, and a direct connection to the police station. The youngest council member, David Park, was scrolling through something on his tablet with the distracted attention of someone who had grown up assuming that all information was instantly accessible. The police said this was a pretty unusual case, he noted without looking up. 8 guys with criminal records, all knocked unconscious during some kind of internal fight. Sounds like you were incredibly lucky. Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral as she distributed copies of her security assessment. Luck isn't a sustainable security strategy, Mr. Park. These men specifically targeted our library because they perceived it as an isolated, vulnerable location. We need to ensure that perception doesn't attract future criminal attention. Council member Frank Morrison, who owned the hardware store on Main Street and had strong opinions about government spending, frowned at the budget figures in Sarah's proposal. $28,000 for security equipment seems excessive for a building that's had 1 incident in 12 years of operation. The cost of prevention is always less than the cost of dealing with consequences, Sarah replied smoothly. Consider what might have happened if those men hadn't turned on each other. Property damage, potential lawsuits, trauma counseling for staff and patrons, not to mention the impact on our community's sense of safety. Mayor Elizabeth Watson, who had been quietly reviewing the proposal while her colleagues debated, finally spoke up. Sarah, what exactly are you recommending? Walk us through the specific improvements you think we need. Sarah moved to the presentation easel and began outlining her security plan with the methodical thoroughness that had made her an effective librarian. First, perimeter monitoring with motion-activated cameras covering all entry points. Second, silent alarm systems with direct police notification. Third, reinforced locks and security glass for vulnerable access points. She turned to face the council directly. Fourth, emergency communication systems that can't be easily disabled. And fifth, staff training for emergency situations, including lockdown procedures and patron safety protocols. Council member Patricia Cox, who worked as a nurse at the county hospital, had been studying the incident report with professional interest. The police report mentions that you handled the situation remarkably well for a civilian. Did you have some kind of emergency training that helped you stay calm? Sarah paused for just a moment, her mind calculating how much truth she could safely reveal. I've taken some basic self-defense courses over the years, she said carefully. But mostly I think I was just very fortunate that the situation resolved itself without anyone getting seriously injured. The lie came easily because she had been practicing it for 3 weeks, refining the details until they sounded natural and unremarkable. The truth about her background remained locked, away in classified files that these well-meaning council members would never have clearance to access. David Park finally looked up from his tablet, apparently having found something that captured his attention. Actually, there's been some interesting social media chatter about that night. People are calling you the battle librarian and making jokes about not messing with people who organize books for a living. Sarah felt a small chill of concern. Public attention was exactly what she had spent 15 years trying to avoid. Social media tends to exaggerate everything, she said dismissively. I'm sure the story has grown in the telling. Mayor Watson was studying Sarah with the shrewd attention of someone who had spent decades reading people in political contexts. The police seemed satisfied with their investigation, but Detective Thompson mentioned that some aspects of the case were unusual. 8 experienced criminals all ending up unconscious seems like quite a coincidence. Criminal enterprises often collapse due to poor leadership and internal conflicts, Sarah replied, drawing on her extensive knowledge of how violent organizations actually functioned. When you put together a group of individuals with impulse, control problems and give them weapons, the results are often unpredictable. Frank Morrison was still focused on the financial aspects of the proposal. Even if we approve this security upgrade, who's going to monitor all these cameras and alarms? We can't afford to hire additional security personnel. Sarah had anticipated this objection. The system I'm proposing is largely automated. Motion sensors trigger recordings, alarms connect directly to police dispatch, and the cameras store footage digitally for review if needed. The only ongoing cost would be maintenance and occasional system updates. Barbara Hensley looked troubled by something she couldn't quite articulate. Sarah, you seem very knowledgeable about security systems for someone who works in library services. Where did you learn about perimeter monitoring and emergency protocols? The question was innocent enough, but Sarah recognized the kind of casual inquiry that could lead to deeper investigation if not handled carefully. I've been researching security options since the incident, she explained. I've consulted with several companies, reviewed case studies of similar facilities, and spoken with law enforcement about best practices. It was mostly true, though it omitted the fact that Sarah's knowledge of security systems came from years of defeating them rather than installing them. She had spent the better part of a decade learning how to bypass every type of surveillance and alarm technology that money could buy. Councilmember Cox was still studying the incident report with obvious puzzlement. According to the medical reports, the attackers had injuries consistent with falling, running into objects and fighting each other, but the pattern seems almost too neat. Like someone with medical knowledge knew exactly where to apply force for maximum effect. Sarah maintained her composed expression while her mind raced through possible responses. I'm not qualified to interpret medical reports, she said finally. I can only tell you what I observed, which was a chaotic situation that somehow resolved itself favorably. Mayor Watson made a decision that ended the uncomfortable line of questioning. The important thing is that no one was seriously hurt, and the perpetrators are facing appropriate criminal charges. Sarah's security proposal seems reasonable given the circumstances. She looked around the table at her fellow council members, all in favor of approving the library security upgrade as presented. The vote was unanimous, though Frank Morrison grumbled about the expense, and David Park suggested that they should consider installing the same system at other municipal buildings. Sarah accepted their approval with appropriate gratitude while mentally calculating how the new security system would affect her own activities. As the council meeting concluded and the members began gathering their papers and personal belongings, Detective Thompson appeared in the doorway of the conference room. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly, though she maintained the same professional demeanor she had shown throughout the security presentation. "Sorry to interrupt," Thompson said to the room in general. "Miss Chun, could I speak with you for a moment? Just a follow-up question about the case." Sarah nodded politely and followed Thompson into the hallway outside the conference room. The detective's expression was friendly but focused, suggesting this wasn't a casual social interaction. "The suspects have all recovered enough to be interviewed," Thompson explained. "Their stories are interesting. They all insist that you weren't what you appeared to be, that you somehow fought back against them." Sarah's expression showed appropriate confusion. "Detective, we've been through this. I hid behind the circulation desk while they fought among themselves. I never engaged with them physically." Thompson consulted his notebook, though Sarah suspected he had memorized the relevant details. "They specifically claim that you demonstrated martial arts skills and defeated them systematically. They're describing combat techniques that most civilians wouldn't know exist. They're trying to minimize their own responsibility." Sarah replied with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts. "It's embarrassing for 8 grown men to admit they were defeated by their own incompetence, so they're creating a fantasy about the librarian fighting back." The detective nodded slowly, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. "That was my initial assessment as well. But their descriptions are remarkably consistent and surprisingly detailed for people who supposedly suffered head trauma." Sarah met his gaze directly, projecting the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. "Detective, I appreciate your thoroughness, but the physical evidence supports the official conclusion. 8 men with weapons and criminal records somehow managed to incapacitate themselves through poor coordination and internal conflict. The security footage from that night," Thompson said carefully, "shows some gaps in coverage. Technical glitches, according to the system logs." Sarah had been expecting this question since the night of the incident. "The library's security system is old and unreliable," she explained. "That's one of the reasons I'm requesting the upgrade that the council just approved." Thompson made a note in his pad, though Sarah suspected it was more for show than actual record keeping. 1. Last question. The suspects keep mentioning that you seem to know things about their backgrounds and criminal activities that weren't obvious from their appearance. How would you explain that? "I've worked with the public for 12 years, Sarah replied. "You learn to read people, to recognize when someone might be dangerous or unstable. These men weren't exactly subtle about their criminal intentions." The detective closed his notebook and smiled in a way that suggested the conversation was over but not necessarily concluded. "Well, Ms. Chen, you certainly handled an extraordinary situation with remarkable composure. The community is lucky to have someone so capable managing our library." Sarah returned his smile with exactly the right amount of modest appreciation. "I just did what anyone would do in that situation, Detective. I'm grateful that things worked out as well as they did." As Thompson walked away, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The official story had held under scrutiny, the security upgrades had been approved, and the detective's investigation was apparently concluding without uncomfortable revelations about her background. But she also recognized that maintaining her cover would require ongoing vigilance. Word was spreading about the incident, social media was creating myths and legends, and law enforcement was asking questions that came uncomfortably close to truth she couldn't afford to reveal. 3 weeks later, Sarah was cataloging new acquisitions when she noticed a man watching her from the biography section. He was average height and build, wearing unremarkable clothing that would have made him invisible in any crowd. But something about his posture and the way he moved between the stacks triggered recognition patterns that Sarah had hoped never to use again. She continued her work while tracking his movement through her peripheral vision. He wasn't browsing books randomly like a typical patron. His attention was focused entirely on her, and he was positioning himself to observe her activities from multiple angles. Professional surveillance. The kind conducted by people who knew how to watch without being obvious about it. Sarah finished entering the new books into the computer system and made her way to the reference desk, choosing a route that would require the watcher to reposition himself if he wanted to maintain visual contact. As expected, he moved to a different section of the library, confirming her suspicions about his intentions. She had been discovered. After 15 years of carefully constructed anonymity, someone had connected the quiet librarian of Millbrook with the classified operative who had officially died in a training accident in 2009. The question was whether this surveillance represented an immediate threat or simply routine intelligence gathering. Sarah's former employers had a complex relationship with retired assets. Sometimes they left them alone to live peaceful civilian lives. Sometimes they decided that certain knowledge was too dangerous to leave uncontrolled. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon conducting normal library activities while mentally preparing for the possibility that her peaceful life in Millbrook was about to end. She helped patrons find research materials, answered questions about library policies, and organized the children's section for the next day's story time. But underneath the routine activities, she was calculating escape routes, assessing potential weapons, and reviewing contingency plans that she had hoped never to implement. The skills that had made her valuable to her former employers were still there, carefully maintained even during years of civilian life. As closing time approached, the surveillance operative made his move. He approached the circulation desk with a book about local history, playing the role of a patron interested in the community's past. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying no particular accent or distinguishing characteristics. "I'm researching the families who settled this area in the 1800s. Do you have any genealogical resources that might help?" Sarah smiled with the professional helpfulness that was second nature after 12 years of public service. "Certainly. Our local history collection is quite comprehensive. Let me show you what we have available." She led him to the genealogy section, aware that they were now in a part of the library with limited sight lines and no security cameras. If this conversation was going to become something other than routine reference assistance, this would be where it happened. "You know," the man said as he pretended to examine a collection of cemetery records, "it's interesting how people can reinvent themselves when they move to a new place. New name, new profession, new identity. Sometimes you'd never know who they used to be." Sarah continued organizing the genealogy materials with steady hands. "People come to small towns for all kinds of reasons," she agreed. "Fresh starts, career changes, family connections. The past doesn't always define the present." The man selected a volume about early settlers and opened it to a random page. "Unless someone starts drawing attention to themselves, like fighting off 8 armed criminals single-handedly. That kind of thing tends to make people curious about backgrounds and capabilities." Sarah met his eyes directly for the first time. "I think you've been misinformed about what happened that night. The police investigation was quite thorough." "I'm sure it was," the man agreed. "But some organizations have resources that go beyond standard police work. They can see patterns and connections that others might miss. He closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. The good news is that certain people are pleased with how you handled the situation. Professionally executed, minimal collateral damage, official story maintained. Very clean work. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. If her former employers were pleased rather than concerned, it suggested that her cover remained intact and her civilian life could continue. But it also meant they were still watching, still evaluating, still ready to make decisions about her future. "I'm just a librarian," she said quietly. "I organize books and help people find information. Whatever you think you know about my background." "You're mistaken." The man smiled with genuine appreciation. "Of course you are. And you're very good at it. The community is fortunate to have someone so dedicated to their service." He began walking toward the library's exit, pausing only to add, "Enjoy your security upgrade, Miss Chun. I'm sure it will make everyone feel much safer." As the door closed behind him, Sarah stood alone among the genealogy books, surrounded by the documented histories of families who had built lives in this quiet community over more than a century. She had become part of that history now, another name in the record of people who had found sanctuary in Millbrook. But she also understood that some kinds of knowledge could never be completely erased, and some skills could never be entirely forgotten. The woman who had once been one of the most dangerous operatives in the world was still there beneath the surface, carefully controlled but always ready. The Millbrook Public Library would remain a sanctuary of learning and community service. Sarah Chun would continue to help patrons find the information they needed and organize programs that enriched their lives. And if anyone else made the mistake of threatening this place or these people, they would discover that some librarians had learned their lessons in very different schools than most. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and Sarah Chun had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like her old life. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Millbrook Public Library as she unlocked the front doors, breathing in the familiar scent of books and possibility that had become her daily comfort. The new security system hummed quietly. In the background, its sensors and cameras providing the protection that the city council had approved. What they didn't know was that Sarah had modified the installation, adding capabilities that went far beyond standard municipal security. If anyone came looking for her again, she would have advance warning. Mrs. Patterson from Elm Street was waiting by the doors with her weekly stack of romance novels, her face lighting up when she saw Sarah approaching with the keys. At 73, Mrs. Patterson had been coming to the library every Tuesday for 8 years, and her reading habits were as predictable as sunrise. "Good morning, Sarah," she called out cheerfully. "I finished those 3 you recommended last week. Do you have anything new with a Scottish hero? You know how I love those accents." Sarah smiled as she disarmed the security system and held the door open. "I set aside 2 new arrivals that I think you'll enjoy, Mrs. Patterson. They're on the reserved shelf behind the circulation desk." These were the moments that reminded Sarah why she had chosen this life over her previous existence. Mrs. Patterson didn't need to know that the woman helping her find romance novels had once been capable of eliminating threats with surgical precision. She only needed to know that Sarah understood her reading preferences and cared enough to remember them. The library filled with its usual Tuesday crowd as the morning progressed. College students claimed the corner tables with their laptops and textbooks, transforming the quiet space into an industrious hive of academic activity. Parents with toddlers gravitated toward the children's section, where picture books promised brief respites from the chaos of raising small humans. Around 10:30, a new face appeared among the familiar patrons. The woman looked to be in her early 40s, professionally dressed in a way that suggested government employment or corporate consulting. She moved through the library with the careful attention of someone conducting a preliminary assessment rather than searching for reading material. Sarah tracked her movement while helping a high school student find sources for a history report on World War II. The stranger's path through the library seemed random to casual observation, but Sarah recognized the pattern of someone mapping exits, sight lines, and potential defensive positions. When the woman finally approached the circulation desk, she carried a book about local architecture that provided perfect cover for initiating conversation. "Excuse me," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm writing an article about historic buildings in small towns. Could you tell me about the architectural significance of this library?" Sarah accepted the book and opened it to a page showing the library's original construction plans from 1923. The building was designed in the neoclassical revival style, she explained, though her attention was focused on reading the subtle signals in the woman's posture and expression. The Carnegie Foundation provided funding, which is why you see similar design elements in libraries across the Midwest. The woman nodded with apparent interest. "How long have you worked here? You seem very knowledgeable about the building's history." 12 years, Sarah replied, maintaining the professional friendliness that was expected while evaluating potential threat levels. "You develop an appreciation for the architecture when you spend this much time inside it. I imagine you've seen a lot of changes in that time," the woman continued. "I heard there was some excitement here recently. A break-in that turned into quite a story." Sarah's hands remained steady as she processed the returned book, but internally she shifted into a higher state of alertness. "It was an unfortunate incident," she said calmly. "But the new security system should prevent anything like that from happening again." The woman leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice to a conversational whisper. "The police report made for interesting reading. 8 men, all with violent criminal histories, somehow managed to defeat themselves, almost like they encountered something they weren't prepared for." Sarah met her gaze directly. "Sometimes criminals make poor decisions that lead to unintended consequences. The important thing is that no innocent people were harmed." "Indeed," the woman agreed, "though I understand the suspects maintain that events didn't unfold quite the way the official report describes." The conversation was moving into territory that required careful navigation. Sarah recognized the techniques being employed: interrogation, disguised as casual inquiry, leading questions designed to elicit specific responses, and the gradual escalation of pressure that marked professional intelligence gathering. People who commit violent crimes often try to shift responsibility for their failures. Sarah replied with the tone of someone stating obvious facts. Creating elaborate stories about their victims fighting back helps them avoid acknowledging their own incompetence. The woman smiled again, and this time it seemed more genuine. "You have an interesting perspective on criminal psychology for a librarian. You encounter all types of people in public service," Sarah said. "You learn to understand human nature, both its positive and negative aspects." A young mother with twin toddlers approached the desk, clearly needing assistance with checking out a stack of parenting books. Sarah welcomed the interruption, using the distraction to create space between herself and the probing questions. As she helped the mother navigate the checkout process and recommended additional resources for managing energetic 2-year-olds, Sarah was aware that the mysterious woman had moved to a reading table within earshot. She was pretending to review the architecture book while obviously listening to every word of the conversation. After the mother left with her children and books, Sarah returned her attention to the woman at the table. "Is there anything else I can help you find for your article?" The woman closed the book and stood up with fluid grace that reminded Sarah of her own carefully controlled movements. "Actually, I think I have everything I need. You've been very helpful." She paused at the circulation desk and placed a business card next to the computer terminal. "If you ever decide you'd like a change of scenery, Miss Chun, there are organizations that value people with your particular combination of skills and discretion. Sarah glanced at the card without picking it up. It bore only a phone number and the name Julia Morrison in simple black text. No company logo, no title, no indication of what kind of organization Julia Morrison might represent. "I'm very happy with my current position," Sarah said politely. "The library serves an important function in this community, and I find the work personally fulfilling." Julia nodded as if she had expected that response. "Of course, but circumstances change, and it's good to have options available. The number on that card reaches people who remember your previous work with appreciation." She walked toward the front entrance, then turned back for one final comment. "By the way, the security modifications you made to the new system are quite impressive. Whoever installed those additional capabilities clearly understands defensive protocols at a professional level." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. If Julia Morrison knew about the security modifications, it meant her background check had been more thorough than a simple records review. Someone had been inside the library, probably during off hours, examining her work with equipment sophisticated enough to detect military-grade surveillance technology. After Julia left, Sarah picked up the business card and studied it carefully. The paper quality was expensive, the printing was professional, and the phone number had an area code she didn't recognize. No digital footprint, no corporate identification, nothing that would lead to productive research using standard information resources, but the message was clear. Her former employers were still monitoring her activities, still evaluating her choices, and still interested in her potential future contributions to missions that officially didn't exist. Sarah slipped the card into her desk drawer and returned to her normal duties. A group of elementary school students arrived for their scheduled library orientation, their teacher herding them toward the children's section with the patient determination of someone who had learned to manage chaos through routine and clear expectations. "Welcome to the library," Sarah called out to the students as they settled into the story corner. "Who can tell me what makes libraries special places?" A 7-year-old girl with pigtails raised her hand enthusiastically. "They have lots of books, and you can borrow them for free, and there are nice people who help you find what you need." Sarah smiled with genuine warmth. "That's exactly right. Libraries are places where everyone is welcome, where knowledge is shared freely, and where people help each other learn and grow." As she began reading to the children from a picture book about friendship and courage, Sarah reflected on the choices that had brought her to this moment. She could have remained in her previous profession, could have continued solving problems through violence and deception, could have accepted assignments that challenged her skills and provided the adrenaline rush that came with high-stakes operations. Instead, she had chosen to build something positive, to protect a sanctuary where children could discover the magic of stories and adults could find the information they needed to improve their lives. The skills that had once made her valuable to intelligence agencies were now employed in service of a community that trusted her with their most precious resource, their curiosity and desire to learn. The business card in her desk drawer represented a path back to her former existence, but Sarah knew that some doors, once closed, should remain that way. Julia Morrison and the organization she represented would have to find someone else for whatever mission they had in mind. The Millbrook Public Library needed its head librarian, and Sarah Chun had found her calling in helping others discover the transformative power of knowledge. Some battles were worth fighting, and this quiet war against ignorance and isolation was one she intended to win, one reader at a time. As the school group prepared to leave, the little girl with pigtails approached Sarah with a serious expression. "Miss Sarah," she whispered, "my mom says you're the bravest person in town because you scared away the bad men who came here." Sarah knelt down to the child's eye level. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," she said gently. "It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. And the most important thing is to take care of the people and places we love." The girl nodded solemnly and gave Sarah a spontaneous hug before rejoining her classmates. As they filed out of the library, chattering excitedly about the books they planned to check out on their next visit, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that came from choosing the right life over the easy one. The phone number on Julia Morrison's business card would go unanswered, and eventually, the people who remembered her previous work would accept that some operatives truly did retire. The most dangerous battles weren't always fought with weapons and violence. Sometimes they were won by refusing to fight at all. 2 years later, Sarah Chun stood before a packed auditorium at the State Library Conference, addressing an audience of librarians from across the region. The topic of her presentation was creating safe spaces, community security in public libraries, and her expertise had become legendary among her professional peers. The fundamental principle, she explained to the attentive crowd, is that libraries must be sanctuaries where every person feels protected and valued. When we achieve that goal, we create something more powerful than any security system technology alone can provide. In the audience, heads nodded in agreement. Sarah had become a sought-after speaker, consulting with libraries nationwide about security protocols and emergency preparedness. Her reputation had grown not from the dramatic incident that nearly destroyed her cover, but from the practical wisdom she shared about creating genuinely safe environments for learning. What none of them knew was that Sarah's expertise came from years of studying how to breach security rather than maintain it. She understood vulnerabilities because she had once exploited them professionally, and she knew how predators thought because she had once hunted far more dangerous prey than the criminals who had stumbled into her library that October night. During the question period, a young librarian from a rural branch raised her hand. "Ms. Chun, how do you balance being welcoming to all patrons while still maintaining awareness of potential threats?" Sarah smiled with the warmth that had made her beloved in Millbrook. "Trust your instincts, but don't let suspicion replace compassion. Most people who enter our libraries are seeking help, knowledge, or simply a quiet place to exist peacefully. The few who come with harmful intentions usually reveal themselves through behavior patterns that trained staff can recognize." After her presentation, Sarah was approached by Dr. Amanda Foster, the conference organizer and head of the State Library Association. "Sarah, that was exceptional as always. I have a favor to ask you. Would you consider writing a book about library security? Your insights could help librarians nationwide." Sarah considered the request carefully. A book would increase her visibility significantly, potentially drawing unwanted attention from people who had learned to leave her alone over the past 2 years. But it would also allow her to share knowledge that could protect other librarians and their communities. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Let me finish the current training manual I'm developing for small-town libraries, and then we can discuss a broader publication." That evening, Sarah drove back to Millbrook through the familiar countryside, watching the sunset paint the October sky in shades that reminded her of autumn leaves and peaceful endings. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Offer still stands. New challenges available. JM." Sarah deleted the message without responding, as she had dozens of others over the past 2 years. Julia Morrison remained persistent but respectful, understanding that recruitment required patience when dealing with someone who had truly chosen a different path. The Millbrook Public Library looked exactly as it had on that night 2 years ago, except for the discreet security enhancements that had become a model for other institutions. Sarah parked in her usual spot and walked through the front doors, breathing in the scent of books and knowledge that had become her definition of home. "Welcome back," called out Marcus Webb, the part-time assistant she had hired 18 months earlier. At 26, Marcus was working toward his library science degree while managing the evening shift with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded Sarah why she loved this profession. "How were things while I was gone?" Sarah asked, checking the Circulation desk for any issues that needed immediate attention. Quiet and productive, Marcus reported. Mrs. Patterson finished another Scottish romance and is demanding more recommendations. The Hendricks twins discovered graphic novels and have been camping in the teen section all week. Oh, and we had a visit from someone asking about our security protocols. Sarah paused in reviewing the day's returns. What kind of questions? Marcus consulted his notes. Professional interest, she said. Mentioned she was consulting for other libraries about safety measures. Seemed to know quite a bit about our setup already. Sarah felt the familiar tingle of awareness that had kept her alive through years of dangerous work. Did she leave a name or contact information? Julia something, Marcus said, flipping through his notepad. Didn't leave a card, but she seemed impressed with our systems. Said whoever designed them clearly understood both security and patron accessibility. Sarah nodded calmly while mentally cataloging this development. Julia Morrison's visits were becoming more frequent and more direct. The recruiting organization she represented was apparently growing impatient with Sarah's continued refusal to engage. If she comes back, Sarah said carefully, let me know immediately. Some consultants are more interested in gathering intelligence than providing actual assistance. Marcus looked puzzled but nodded agreement. Will do. Anything else I should know about? Sarah considered how much truth she could safely share with her dedicated assistant. Just remember that libraries can attract attention from people with various motivations. Most are genuinely interested in our services, but occasionally we encounter individuals who see our openness as vulnerability. After Marcus left for the evening, Sarah conducted her own security check of the building. Everything appeared normal, but she noticed subtle signs that someone with professional training had examined their systems during her absence. Door frames showed microscopic scratches where specialized tools had tested lock mechanisms. Security camera angles had been slightly adjusted to eliminate blind spots that only an expert would recognize. Julia Morrison or her associates had been inside the library, conducting a thorough assessment of its defenses. The message was clear. They knew exactly how well protected Sarah's sanctuary was, and they wanted her to know they could breach it whenever they chose. Sarah activated the enhanced security protocols she had installed but never mentioned to the city council. Motion sensors that could detect breathing patterns. Audio pickups sensitive enough to identify whispered conversations. Camera systems that used facial recognition to alert her about specific individuals on government watch lists. The next morning brought unexpected news. Detective Thompson called while Sarah was processing overnight book returns. Miss Chun, I thought you'd want to know the last of those men who broke into your library is being released today. Served his full sentence without parole violations. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Thank you for letting me know, Detective. Do you anticipate any problems with his release? Probably not, Thompson said. He's been a model prisoner, apparently found religion, and spent most of his time in the prison library. But I wanted to give you a heads up in case you notice anyone unusual around the area. That afternoon, as Sarah was leading a children's reading circle, she noticed a man sitting alone at a table near the periodical section. He was the right age and build to be the released prisoner, though 2 years in prison had changed his appearance. Enough that she couldn't be certain without a closer look. She finished reading the story about a brave little mouse who saved her. Forest friends helped the children choose books to take home, and then approached the man's table with professional curiosity. Can I help you find anything specific? She asked pleasantly. The man looked up from the magazine he had been pretending to read. His eyes held a mixture of recognition and something that might have been respect. You're her, he said quietly. The librarian who... Sarah sat down across from him. Who what? Who taught 8 grown men that assumptions can be dangerous, he said. I've spent 2 years thinking about that night, trying to understand what really happened. Sarah studied his face, noting the changes that incarceration and reflection had wrought. What conclusion did you reach? That we picked the wrong target, he said simply. And that sometimes the universe sends exactly the lesson you need, even when you're too stupid to ask for it. He leaned forward slightly. I came here to apologize. Not just for what we tried to do to you, but for violating this place. Libraries were my refuge when I was a kid, the only safe place I knew. I should have remembered that. Sarah felt the tension leave her shoulders. What are your plans now? Clean slate, he said. Got my GED in prison, earned certification in computer repair. Going to try building something instead of tearing things down. He paused. The others, the ones who remember that night, they tell stories about you. About how you moved, how you knew things. They think you were some kind of secret agent or special forces. Sarah smiled. And what do you think? I think you were exactly what you appeared to be, he said. A librarian protecting her library. Everything else is just details. As he prepared to leave, he turned back one final time. Thank you, Miss Chun, for the lesson, for the chance to become someone different, and for keeping this place safe for people who need it. That evening, as Sarah locked the library doors and walked to her car, she noticed Julia Morrison waiting by the driver's side door. No pretense this time. No cover story about architectural research. Impressive work with your former visitor. Julia said, turning an enemy into an ally takes rare skill. Sarah unlocked her car but didn't get in. He was never really an enemy. Just someone who made bad choices and found a way to make better ones. That's exactly the kind of perspective we value, Julia said. The world needs people who can see solutions where others see only problems. Sarah looked at the woman who represented her former life with all its complexity and moral ambiguity. I've found my solution, Julia. This library, this community. This work, it's where I belong. Julia nodded with what appeared to be genuine understanding. I know. But when you're ready for a new challenge, when the quiet life starts feeling too quiet, remember that some battles can only be fought by people with your particular combination of skills and values. She walked away into the darkness, and Sarah knew it would be the last recruitment attempt. Some doors, once closed, stayed closed. Some choices, once made, defined everything that followed. Sarah Chun drove home through the peaceful streets of Millbrook, past houses where families were, settling in for quiet evenings of homework help and bedtime stories. Tomorrow she would return to the library, would help Mrs. Patterson find another Scottish romance, would guide students through research projects, would maintain the sanctuary that had become her greatest victory. The most dangerous people, really, were often the ones who looked the most harmless. But sometimes, the most powerful thing a dangerous person could do was choose to be harmless instead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.